It's the off-season, so it means, of course, we're talking football in the off-season edition of Krown Countdown U. Welcome to the January edition of KCU, and we've got a very special announcement coming straight out of the gate. That's why you saw the line producer / producer to the right of me here, Andrew Wadden. Andrew, we have a radio edition of KCU hitting the airwaves across many parts of the TSN radio network. Tell us about it, because you developed a large part of it.
Well, yeah, starting this week, we're going to be on the radio with KCU Radio. But it's kind of something we've been wanting to do for the last several years, really. And we found a platform with TSN Radio in Vancouver. Many of you probably don't know that the hub for TSN Radio in Vancouver is in Vancouver, that is. And we're making a national show that's going out across Canada, across the TSN network. We're going to be on in Winnipeg, Ottawa, and Vancouver to start for now, but hoping that Toronto, Edmonton, and others get on board as well. Pretty exciting for us. It's going to be a weekly show, 1 hour, yourself, and of course, Mike Hogan from Toronto is going to be your co-host. So very exciting, and it's going to be great for us because we're going to be able to do something different, especially the fact that we're starting in the off season. We can start to do basketball, hockey, and of course our flagship football. So really exciting news, and I can't wait to get it going.
For those of you who don't know, Mike Hogan is the voice of the Toronto Argonauts, but he's a big U Sports guy and a big college guy. How important is it to have a guy from Toronto like Mike Hogan involved in this particular radio show?
Well, I mean, just like we do with the television show when we bring Justin Dunk from Toronto as well on board, it just gives us that much more reach across Canada. Of course, Ontario is a big center for not only football, but for basketball and hockey and U sports in general. Having someone like Mike on board with his perspective, the people that he talks to aren't necessarily the people that we talk to every single day, especially since we're out on the West Coast in Vancouver. So it gives us that angle as well, and we reach that much further across Canada, and we can get that much further and deeper into stories and athletes that we want to promote. And I mean, it's just a win-win, I think, for all of us. And of course, with Mike already being involved with TSN Radio, again, it just makes sense.
Now, is the show going to be about personalities? Is it going to be about issues? How is the 1 hour that we're going to do on radio be different than what we do in this half hour on TV?
Well, I mean, of course, with the off-season edition, we are going to incorporate basketball and hockey into the show as well, which is something that we've done in the past with KCU, but on a smaller scale when we did the Canada West show last year. So we're going to be able to get into that sort of side of things. But of course, with football, I mean, it's different with television because you kind of have to, do the interviews a certain way, make sure everything's shot a certain way. With radio, it's a little more loose, and I think that's how we'll run things. Of course, with it being weekly with us, we can get into different stories, different players, whether it's in Quebec, whether it's in Western Canada, Ontario. We are going to be very similar in terms of the content. I'm sure we'll share content between the shows. But at the same time, radio and TV are just different entities, and it'll allow us to do different, unique things with the show.
Now, one of the reasons that we took on this show on the television side was that there was nothing like this promoting Canadian college football. But with the radio show, we will cross the line and focus on Canadian athletes in the NCAA. And, a great starting point is basketball, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just take a look at what's happened with basketball in Canada over, the last 20 years. I mean, we, first overall picks in the NBA, 2 of them. One of them not so good, but and then of course with football as well, there's just more and more athletes that are getting down, starting to play the Div 1 schools, not just playing the lower level schools. They're, Jonathan Kongbo at Tennessee, great example. There's a guy that we would definitely want to talk about because here's a guy who's from our area out here in British Columbia who's making huge waves down in D1 football. So, with us, maybe we can't maybe touch on that so much when we're doing the U Sports season. So it's going to give us that other platform to be able to talk about guys that we necessarily can't squeeze into our TV show sometimes.
Now, yes, we'll be talking about NCAA college hockey and U Sports hockey and the basketball on both sides. But first and foremost, this is a football show, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Let's not get it twisted. We know where our bread is buttered, and that's on the football field. Huge emphasis is going to be on football, of course, with Hogan being, the voice of the Toronto Argonauts and how connected he is with the OUA, yourself being I'll call it the godfather of youth sports football in Canada.
They only call people godfathers when they get to a certain age, so I'll take that with a grain of salt.
You're borderline now. But yeah, it's definitely going to be football first. And when we're in football season, it's not only going to be first, it's going to be second, third, and fourth as well. But once now we're into the off season like we are now, it's going to give us that time to be able to incorporate basketball and hockey into things. And honestly, I'm excited about it because although you guys are huge football guys, when I first came into this, I wasn't. I was basketball, hockey kind of first, and then football sort of third after that, or second, if you will. And now I've got myself up to speed, but I want to get back into those stories that are basketball and hockey related because that's kind of my background, and I'm excited to be able to promote those kind of athletes.
Well, while we may not be on in every city across Canada to start out with, there will be a number of ways that people can listen into the show. How do they go about doing that?
Absolutely. TSN.ca is where you'll find us. You'll find the podcast on there. You can find it on iHeartRadio as well, SoundCloud, iTunes. We are going to put the show out as a podcast before the show goes to air in most markets. It depends because in Vancouver, for instance, we're kind of floating around on what time we're going to be on, especially now in the off season. So that's going to give everyone an opportunity that on Wednesdays when we record, Wednesday evening, it's going to be out. You're going to be able to listen to a new edition of KCU Radio.
Andrew Wadden, thanks very much for doing this. And now let's take a look at where some of the top recruits from the CFC Top 100 have landed across the country. Okay, now it's time for the KCU Roundtable, and as you can see, I've got Gord Randall to the right of me, and via Skype from Toronto, there is Mr. Justin Dunk. Now, in this off-season, I think we've probably had the most eventful off-season in 20 years, and when we're talking about off-season, we're only talking about 5 weeks. Let's start with the big shift for the Bishops Gators from going to from the RSEQ to the AUS, turning both conferences into 5-team conferences. Who are the winners and who are the losers here, Gord?
Well, an obvious winner to start with has got to be Bishops themselves. I've been a big fan of the idea of this move for them ever since the idea of it came up about a year ago at this time. And I think for them to actually execute it, and execute it in a fairly timely fashion as well, I think really works out well for them. You've mentioned in the past, Jim, they are a very similar institution to a lot of the institutions in the AUS. They fit in well there. They already had an academic association with those institutions as well. And I just think that they were a bit of a minnow in the last couple of years, looked like a bit of a minnow swimming above their heads. Now, I do know that there are certain Bishops alumni, in particular pro alumni, who don't feel the same way about that. They feel like this is a bit of a cop-out move. They feel like Bishops had everything in place to compete in the RSAQ and that they belonged on that stage, to which I would kind of tell those people, open your eyes. I think on the football field at least, and that's where I'm fully concerned, this is a great move for Bishops. I also think it's a pretty good move for the Interlock because you no longer have this weird Frankenstein Interlock where two of the Quebec teams are playing amongst themselves and everybody else is doing Interlock stuff. Now you can just match up 5-on-5. So if you maintain the RSEQ AUS Interlock, I think this works out well just purely from a numbers perspective as well. And additionally, I also think that the rest of the RSEQ are winners too. Now, if you're Laval and Montreal, maybe it hurts getting one less de facto bye week a year, but I think it also helps you to have more interesting regular season games more consistently in that conference. And if you want to talk on the losers side, I think on the losers side are the McGills and the Concordias, the teams that were maybe in that tier with Bishops some years, kind of fighting to claw above that tier with Bishops, that are more contemporaries of Bishops than the French schools. Those are the teams that are losers here. I think they lose another team that they are more competitive with more consistently, and it becomes more of a difficult conference for them to claw their way into the playoffs. Now,
Justin, as usual, Gord gives us a lot to chew on there. Let's focus on one thing. right now, and that's the AUS with a 5-team conference with a couple of byes thrown in there as well. This could be the dawning of something pretty special in Atlantic Canada, couldn't it?
It really could be. And guys, I feel like we should be calling it the Maple League, and Gord sort of alluded to it already. I kind of like the ring of it, but we finally get a set of schools that are sort of aligned in terms of their budget and how they run their athletic departments. And that's why I think this is a great move for Bishops and for the AUS to get a 15.
Christian Gagnon, the AD at Laval, and he's also the chair of the RSEQ football committee, came out in December and said that they are open to looking at Interlock. And I know that the RSEQ at their recent meeting at Drummondville looked at every different conceivable type of interlock. Is this the next step for the RSEQ to find a way to play with teams in the OUA? Is that even possible? Can they do it with Canada West with the travel? What are your thoughts on this, Justin?
To me, the travel will not bother anyone in the Quebec Conference. You know, I've talked to Glenn Constantine at length about this around the Vanier Cup, and he's all for it in raising the bar in terms of competitiveness across the country. That is what is going to push our game forward and give our athletes an even better chance to get jobs at the pro level, be it the CFL or the NFL. And we've seen some guys make the jump to the NFL from U Sports football. So the competitiveness needs to rise up, and we need to get rid of the regionalization. It can still be there. The traditional rivalries can still happen. Saskatchewan and Regina can play every year, for example. But we need to look at what the NCAA has done, and they have Division 1, 2, and 3, and there's teams in the same area that are in different conferences because they are aligned, as we said earlier, in terms of being like-minded with the way they run their athletic departments, and frankly, how much money is being put into those athletic departments. That's a big reason why Bishops moved. Everyone knows that they were the school that had the smallest budget in terms of football in the RSAQ, and they go to the AUS, and now they're right in the mix there. So I think this is something that has to happen in order for our game to grow to the point that we want it to get to.
And I think one of the things that has been a real move in the right direction the last couple of years is that a lot of the football people are speaking up and saying one important point: football is different. Athletic departments like to just have a blanket umbrella strategy across all sports that works for all sports. And regionalism will continue to be relevant and continue to be a good way to do things in sports like hockey, in sports like basketball, because you have almost every school in that area fielding a team. To compete amongst just the schools in that area makes a lot of sense. Football's a different animal, however. With fewer teams on the field, with a vast range of competitiveness in the football ranks, it works better for you to go beyond that regional thing. And I think the fact that people are slowly starting to realize that this is a different animal that needs to be governed a slightly different way is a huge step in the right direction, Jim.
Well, I think it's important to still have the strength of the conferences there and still have those conference championships. But back to you for a second on this, Justin. What model do you see working for Interlock out of the gate? Is it just Canada West and the RSEQ? Can the OUA find a way with all of its non-combatants in its schedule to play against the RSEQ right across the border? Do a couple of conferences have to take the lead with this, or is there a way right out of the gate to find some sort of pan-national way to start this in 2018?
Well, Jim, you've come up with one way with the Northern 8 idea. I think out of the gate, the easiest way is for the RSEQ now, especially with Bishops gone to the AUS, to get something going with Canada West. I think the issue is for Ontario that there are just so many teams there. And as Gord said, they really like to play that schedule. And the Yates Cup, in a lot of ways, even when I was growing up, was billed as the biggest trophy you could win if you grew up in Ontario. So I think if the Canada West and RSAQ can get it rolling and show how well it can work, then I think the OUA won't want to miss out, and they'll jump in on this and get in, and we'll finally have some sort of interlock. And I want to make this clear. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it definitely can be done.
Quebec's sitting there with an odd number of teams right now. The OUA's sitting there with an odd number of teams. What about a bilingual university like Ottawa, and this is in public view because people have been talking about it, possibly crossing over and playing in the RSEQ?
Absolutely, and like the OUA as one conjoined conference, one single conference, is not something that has been set in the historical record books forever, right? We used to have the OQIFC, I believe that was the moniker for it, where Queens and the two Ottawa teams were involved with the English-speaking at that point in time, primarily Quebec teams. You know, this idea that the OUA is an unbreakable entity probably needs to get thrown off the table. Now, ideally, yeah, ultimately at the end of the day, they're playing for more or less an Ontario championship, but you're right. There's got to be some flexibility involved, and certainly I don't even think it's thinking outside the box to talk about splitting the conference one way or another, even just purely for the sake of this concept here. And I think that's something the OUA leadership needs to work their way through and realize that you can, for an interlock concept, for example, you can split one way. One half the conference in one direction, one half the conference in the other direction, and it's not just breaking up and ruining the legitimacy of OUA Ontario football.
Justin, your thoughts on this, because there has been a lot of talk about either Carleton or Ottawa, or even both perhaps, joining up with the RSEQ. I've talked to people at Carleton. They say no way would they be doing something like that. But Ottawa is intriguing.
It certainly is, Jim. I'm with you, and it would balance out the conferences. It would take away the buys in the OUA as well. Obviously, it would give you, again, 6 in the RSEQ, 10 in the OUA, play that nice balanced schedule. I think for a lot of reasons, it makes sense for Ottawa to go over there to the RSEQ. Carleton, I don't see, and I know Queens used to be in that old conference as well when it was McGill and a few other schools, but to me, Ottawa makes the most sense. One simple move makes it even teams in both conferences.
Let's go to the East-West Shrine game. Anthony Auclair was there playing for the East, of course representing the Laval Rouge et Or. Jeff Gray was there, offensive lineman representing the Manitoba Bisons. Listen to this clip from the NFL Network and tell me if these guys did prep.
Now in Canada, all the defensive backs are Siciliano's height, so he'd have cleared them. He'd be in the end zone. I mean, he's 6'5 and a half, 256. He plays for the Laval Rouge.
Rouge et Or, the red and gold.
Okay. And a couple years ago, we had a guy who Andy Reid calls Frenchie, and his name was Laurent Duvernay-Tardif. And he went in the 5th round to Kansas City, and he's played pretty well. Same college, and this kid's got some of those traits.
In 15 seconds, I heard about 4 gaffes, 1 mocking, and I saw a terrible title at the bottom.
I think that graphic might have been the worst atrocity, Jim. The 2-time offensive star in the Quebec CFL. I mean, we had people on Twitter going, "Where's the Quebec CFL? Like, this sounds really cool." And if I were doing that on a broadcast with me and you doing it, I guarantee I would have heard about it on Twitter from some of the people that follow us. And for somebody like Mike Mayock and guys on the NFL Network to do that, I mean, that's just embarrassing and really unprofessional the way they approached it. It's not a good look for them whatsoever.
Seriously, in this day and age, with Google at our fingertips, to not be able to get a school name right and proper doesn't make any sense. And Laurent Duvernay-Tardif played for McGill. It's a totally different school. And as much respect as I have for Mike Mayock, he's a draft guru, really studies these guys. I'm surprised that he would say something like Canadian DBs are smaller up here. Gord, you mentioned it earlier. It's not like we need to be small to get out of our igloos or something when Anthony Auclair tried to hurdle that defender. We're not that much smaller up here, and I think Anthony Auclair and Jeff Gray sort of point out that there's some big fellas that come from north of the border.
Now, the other big story that's over a month old is Brian Tower is stepping down after 33 years at the helm of the Saskatchewan Huskies. A well-documented story. The story that's relevant right now is who's going to take over in Saskatchewan. It's an open competition. The job's been posted till the end of this month. A couple of names came up outside of Western Canada, namely Ontario. Steph Patazic, who's the offensive coordinator with the Hamilton Tiger Cats right now, and everybody knows him from McMaster, and a certain coach of the year by the name of Michael Faulds. Your thoughts on that, Justin?
to be honest, I don't see either of those guys that you named going out west to Saskatchewan. I'll start with Steph Potasic. He's been in the Hamilton area for years, has his family firmly planted there, and it seems like he's going to get some more coaching opportunity and more development opportunity at the pro level with Hamilton. And then Michael Folds, he's really just getting this Laurier program running. And even though he's a rural boy, he grew up in Guelph, Ontario. Yes, I'll get the plug in there. We went to the same high school. I don't see him going out to the prairies because of what he has going on at Laurier. And his family is pretty settled too. And he just had a second child. So why is he going to uproot his family from a job that he clearly loves in a place that clearly is on the same wavelength as him at Laurier in terms of the type of player they want to bring in to go across the country to Saskatchewan? Just doesn't make sense to me.
So 2 coaches on staff have both applied for the head coaching job. Scott Flory, the offensive coordinator, Brian Giebert, the special teams coordinator. Now, Scott Flory was kind of brought in by that staff as an heir apparent to Brian Tauris, but when you judge his offensive team in terms of where it stands in the Canada West, they were 5th twice and 4th once in terms of producing yards and points. Do you get the sense that it's maybe time for a house cleaning in Saskatchewan, or is Flory the guy here?
Well, it's so much rides on your quarterback in Canadian football, and that is kind of out of Scott Flory's control as the offensive coordinator, I think. Now, Scott Flory is an offensive line guy, and one of the things that I've noticed since he's been there is that they haven't really produced much in the way of offensive line prospects. The last big offensive line prospect to come out of there was Ben Heenan, who is doing well for himself, or was, I should say, before he abruptly retired, doing well for himself in the pros, but it's been pretty thin up front, so it's not like he's producing a ton of talent at his signature position. Now, I know he's not a position coach, but that's another thing that reflects on a coordinator, and it seems like a bit of an uninspired choice. And when you have a coach who's been around for 35 years, typically I think a school kind of wants to go in a different direction. Like, it's like Joe Paterno retiring at Penn State. You don't want to just go with one of his assistants, because sooner or later players need a different voice and a school needs a slightly different direction. So I don't put a ton of stock into that. I think that's it doesn't surprise me that Flory's put his name in for the job, but I don't see him emerging with the job. Now, a couple names that come up, Ryan Shane is the guy that's at the top of my list. Now, I haven't heard specific connections between him and this job, and I don't know that he's quite ready to leave at Calgary yet, but he's a guy who's been, pretty much his entire coaching career, has been a guy who's been tabbed as a head coach of the future. And the job he's done the last couple of years with Calgary has been one of the best in the country. He's been one of the best assistants in the country by far. He's got those leadership qualities. He's now got those connections in the West. I think he'd be a phenomenal out-of-the-park candidate for Saskatchewan at this point in time. Another name that has come up is Pat Tracy, a veteran coach, a guy who many thought should have had a head coaching job at some point in the last 20 years, but my personal feeling with Pat Tracy is he doesn't have any interest in doing so. He doesn't have any interest in leaving here in Vancouver. He's got his daughter here in town with him. He doesn't really enjoy the head coaching parts of coaching. He doesn't enjoy the press conferences. He doesn't enjoy the recruiting. He doesn't enjoy those kinds of things. He just wants to be an X's and O's guy, make his players the best they can be, put the best scheme, the best defensive unit on the field. And I think he's very much happy where he is, getting paid pretty well by a CIS standard to do that here in Vancouver.
Justin, do you see a guy like Ryan Shane holding on for that job in Queens where his dad is right now?
It could certainly be possible, but who knows, how much longer Pat Shane wants to coach. It's pretty clear that he still really likes what he's doing. So if you're Ryan, do you really want to hold out and wait? And maybe an experience at a different school in out west could provide you with some benefits if down the road you think you're going to end up at Queens as head coach. It wouldn't hurt to have experience beforehand in going to a different institution.
Okay, I'm going to throw 3 CFL assistant coaches out there, and I want you to quickly give some hits on these for me. Kelly Jeffrey, Mark Mueller, Craig Dickinson. Craig Dickinson, of course, played the role of scout through the CFL for a number of years, now the special teams guy with the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Mark Mueller, very young, but a prodigal talent as a potential coach with the Stamps. And Kelly Jeffrey moving into his second year with the Toronto Argonauts, but I don't know a guy that's done more with less when you consider what he achieved at Mount Allison. You take a look at those three. First of all, Gord, what are your thoughts?
Well, Kelly Jeffrey, before he jumped to the CFL, would have been one of the upcoming rising star type coaches that guys would be going out trying to find at programs like Saskatchewan. So I think he's got to be a guy that's in the mix as well. In terms of Mark Mueller, the Saskatchewan connection, which is so huge in that province, is there. Making the leap from Regina to Saskatoon area, I should say, and having those connections in Regina, also a potential positive. I don't know if he'd wrap his head around it, but it's possible. And with Craig Dickinson, Craig Dickinson's got the Saskatchewan connection. He knows the area a little bit, but I don't put a lot of stock in CFL experience when you're going with a head coach at this level. We've seen a number of failures going that avenue in the past, primary CFL guys coming down to the CIS and really not doing well. Gary Echeverry comes to mind. Mike Gibson in Regina comes to mind. That doesn't necessarily translate, especially as a head coach, to this level. So that guy would be a little bit down the list for me personally.
Your thoughts, Justin?
I don't see it with Craig Dickinson, to be honest, for the reasons Gord laid out. As for Kelly Jeffrey, I think it's definitely an interesting name and a guy Saskatchewan should really make a push for, because what he did at Mount Allison was nothing short of remarkable from where that program was to where it was when he left there to go to the Argos. But I think that would be too far away from home for Coach Jeffrey, and I think he's pretty comfortable in growing into his role as a special teams coordinator in Toronto. And Mark Mueller, it seems as though he wants to stay in the pros, and if you talk to some people in the CFL, they're pretty high on this guy. He's learned both sides of the ball in the CFL, and if he went back down to U Sports football, I feel like he might get branded as a coach down there and might not have the same sort of career arc that I'm sure he's hoping for, which is looking at a potential coordinating job in the CFL, and who knows, maybe down the line being a Canadian head coach in the Canadian Football League.
Thanks to everybody on the panel. I'd like to remind everyone that the first edition of KCU Radio is coming up, maybe on a station near you on the TSN radio network. But if you look at the bottom of the screen, these are ways that you can listen to it online. For everybody on our KCU production team, let's get out to the game. There's no game to get out to.
You can find a game.